Hello again, class. Today I want to pick up on our series of lessons about the start of the Civil War, or at least the causes of the Civil War. And today we're going to pick up where we left off in our last lesson, which was with the Kansas-Nebraska Act. All right, so as a reminder, in 1854, Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which allowed those territories, basically those remnants of the old Louisiana territories that still haven't been turned into state. You got Nebraska in the north, and just like on our last lesson, the pen's not working, so I guess I'll just have to do without it. But the Nebraska and Kansas territory, right here, and hopefully you are seeing my cursor. I won't point to these areas on the map, but it's the old Louisiana territory, and it's above that 3630 parallel that was supposed to mark the border between slave state and free state. But with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, Congress basically just threw out the Missouri Compromise and came up with new rules, which is basically that the territories of Kansas and Nebraska can choose for themselves whether or not to have slavery. All right, so this idea is called popular sovereignty because the people vote or choose. And what happened is, at least in Kansas, thousands of people started flooding into Kansas to affect the vote. You had people who were pro-slavery and people who were against slavery. And they both showed up in Kansas to vote to try to sway the election to one side or the other. All right, so you had some places, some towns where you might have had, say, 500 or 600 people vote, and only 10 or 20 of them had been living in that town, a week earlier. So you had those sort of shenanigans going on. And ultimately, the slavery group wins the vote. So they voted to allow slavery in Kansas. But abolitionists and the folks who opposed slavery didn't think the election was fair. So they just formed their own government. All right, so for a while, you basically had two different groups of people who were claiming to be the government in Kansas. For Kansas was sort of kind of controlled by two different governments simultaneously. And even worse, you started to have a lot of fighting between the anti-slavery forces and the pro-slavery forces. They started actually fighting each other in Kansas. So in some ways, this is the very first violence and killings of what's going to become the Civil War. Now they didn't, no war had been declared. The states hadn't seceded, and so this isn't really the official start of the Civil War, but it's certainly a tune-up. It's a dress rehearsal, if you will. And so this time period was called Bleeding Kansas, because there's so much bloodshed going on in Kansas that the state ended up with that nickname, Bleeding Kansas. And the most famous example to take place in Bleeding Kansas during this time was a guy named John Brown, very, very staunch abolitionist. Very much thought slavery was a sin, and he decided that it was basically his duty in life to rid the country of slavery, and also to basically punish anyone who participated in the institution of slavery. So one night, he and several of his sons and a few other of his followers went into this camp at a place called Potawatomi Creek, found 5 pro-slavery people who were asleep. John Brown and his men dragged these pro-slavery men basically right out of their beds and murdered them, right there in the camp. And so this is known as the Potawatomi Creek Massacre. And it makes John Brown pretty famous. And he's basically a fugitive from justice at this point, for committing these murders. But he becomes somewhat of a folk hero in the North for really kind of striking a blow for abolitionists. All right, so that's the situation you have in Kansas, in Bleeding Kansas. Then around the same time, you're going to have some changes in the political system. Now let's review. What were the name of the two political parties created during the Age of Jackson? You have the Democrats and the Whigs. Now the Whigs had been formed, over issues like they favored tariffs, they favored a national bank, they pushed for internal improvements, things that we'd call infrastructure today. It was over those types of economic issues that really formed the basis of the Whigs Party, but they didn't necessarily agree with each other on slavery. And so the slavery issue in particular, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act specifically, and I said that backwards, I meant the slavery issue in general, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act in particular, really tore the Whig Party apart. So Southern Whigs joined the Democratic Party, or they joined what was a very short-lived party called the Constitutional Union Party. We'll talk about them briefly later on in this lesson when we get to the election of 1860. But the Constitutional Union Party didn't really last very long. I'm not even sure it lasted for a full 10 years. But it did become a home to some of the old Whigs in the South who didn't necessarily want to join the Democratic Party. And the Whigs in the North formed the Republican Party. Okay, so it's still the same Republican Party we have today. All right, so here you are. By the mid-1850s, the two dominant parties in America are the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, just like they have been for the last, basically 165, 170 years. So now you have, the emergence of those two main political parties. And we're going to see the Republican Party. It's going to be pretty much a northern party, but I'm going to give you a spoiler here. Since there were so many more people in the North than the South, it's going to be able to survive just being a northern party. So it's a little bit of a spoiler and a hint of what we're going to end our lesson on today. Before that, let's talk about the Supreme Court. Let's talk about Dred Scott, aka the worst Supreme Court decision in many scholars' opinions. Now, Dred Scott was a slave who lived in Missouri, which, as we know from the Missouri Compromise, was a slave state. However, his owner took him to Illinois, where slavery was illegal. It was against the law in Illinois. He also took him into those parts of the Louisiana Territory where slavery was illegal, because of the Missouri Compromise. And again, he's traveling there before you've had the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and even after the Kansas-Nebraska Act, Nebraska was always anti-slavery. They voted to ban slavery there in that Nebraska territory. So there were still always parts of this old Louisiana territory that remained, against slavery. And in the event, Dred Scott went to Illinois, went to the part of the Louisiana territory where slavery was illegal. So he filed a lawsuit in the Supreme Court, arguing that he became free when he was taken to those territories. Because after all, if Illinois says slavery is illegal, well, then you can't bring slaves to Illinois. That seems to be a pretty common sense approach. For instance, today Texas says, robbing banks are illegal. Well, someone from Oklahoma can't come to Texas and rob a bank. That's what it means for a state to have its own laws, right? And so that's the argument Dred Scott made. Well, if slavery is going to be illegal in certain parts of the country, that means you can't take your slaves to those parts of the country and keep them as slaves. But the Supreme Court, led by Chief Justice Roger Taney, ruled against Dred Scott. And he ruled that Dred Scott did, in fact, not become free just by traveling to these free territories. So what was the court's reasoning for this? All right, so the official name of this case is Dred Scott versus Sanford. It was issued in 1857, and the Supreme Court ruled that African Americans, even free ones, whose ancestors had never been imported, whose ancestors had been imported to America as a slave could never be a citizen. So we're talking about basically 99% of the African Americans in the United States would fall into this category. And so what the Supreme Court has basically just done is to say that none of the rights in the Constitution and none of the laws, giving privileges to U.S. citizens could ever apply to African Americans. Second, the court rules that the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional because the federal government could not outlaw slavery. Now, in all of the other cases we've studied, McCulloch v. Maryland, Gibbons v. Ogden, Worcester v. Georgia, those cases the federal government always won. Well, they don't exactly win here because Roger Taney throws out basically the Missouri Compromise as unconstitutional and says that the federal government can't outlaw slavery even when it wants to, and even in the territories that are controlled by the federal government. In 3, Roger Taney says slaves are property of their slave's owner. And since the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution gives basically constitutional protections, due process rights to people's property, that slaves can't be taken away from their slave owner under the Constitution. In effect, Taney says, to the extent that the Constitution protects anybody, it's not the slave the Constitution protects, it's the slave owner. Because African Americans, again, can't enjoy any protections of citizenship, while the slave owners apparently, according to Taney and the Supreme Court, have a constitutional right to basically own slaves. All right, so that was the opinion of Taney and the Supreme Court. And again, historians look back on this and can pretty consistently consider this to be the worst decision the Supreme Court ever handed down. Now, there are others that people criticize very heavily as well, but this one seems to be at the top of the list of everyone's worst decision list. All right, so what are the effects? In addition to just making the North very, very angry, the Supreme Court essentially made slavery legal everywhere in the country, and certainly in the federal territories. But it basically meant that even Illinois couldn't keep people from bringing slaves into their state, even though slavery was illegal in Illinois. And certainly in the Louisiana Territory and the Mexican Cession territories, the Supreme Court basically says slavery has to be legal there. So instead of slavery being limited to this stretch of states, basically from Virginia to Texas, Roger Taney just made it legal, perhaps everywhere in the country, but certainly in the 3/4 of the country that either already allowed slavery or hadn't decided the issue because that part of that territory hadn't become states yet. All right, so this greatly increases the places in America where slavery is legal, and it also tells the states that they can never really enforce their own anti-slave laws. Next, African Americans are denied all rights under the Constitution, at least until the Constitution was amended, and I'll give you a preview and a spoiler. It would be. All right. After we talk about the Civil War, we'll talk about certain amendments that were passed to the Constitution, and the 14th Amendment deals with this Dred Scott case. It doesn't mention it, but it very specifically takes care of this issue, the idea that African Americans aren't United States citizens, because the 14th Amendment guarantees them their citizenship rights. Okay. So that's the Dred Scott. Know that case. Okay, know Dred Scott. It's very important because again, it was issued in 1857. This is just a few years before the Civil War, and that is not a coincidence. Okay, this decision really, I think, made people in the North realize that they could never basically legislate away slavery. They were just told they couldn't keep it out of the territories and that they couldn't even enforce their own slave laws. So it becomes pretty clear to abolitionists that, writing laws against slavery, may not work. So you're probably going to need something more drastic. All right, so the year after Dred Scott is handed down, we're going to have a very famous election, not for president, but for senator. As a reminder, Stephen Douglas was a senator from Illinois. He was one of the senators who helped Henry Clay draft the Compromise of 1850. So Stephen Douglas has been senator from Illinois for a little while. And in 1858, Stephen Douglas, as a Democrat, runs for re-election, and Abraham Lincoln is your Republican nominee. So they run against each other to be one of Illinois' senators. And Lincoln opposed the spread of slavery, but Douglas, who by the way had also proposed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, always tried to be very wishy-washy on the issue. He really tried to have it both ways. He never wanted to just come right out and say he wanted slavery to expand, but he also didn't want to do much to limit it. After all, again, he was one of the authors of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which specifically allowed slavery into those territories, assuming the population voted for them. So you had two very different views on slavery. Now, to be clear, I want to make something clear right here. Lincoln, at least in 1858, was not calling for the total and complete abolishment of slavery. I don't think he thought that could happen, at least not in 1858. What Lincoln's idea was to limit slavery to, just that south part, that stretch of states from Virginia to Texas. And if you could limit slavery to that part of the country while the rest of the country was free, Lincoln kind of hoped and thought that slavery would eventually kind of go away on its own. That part of the country would eventually phase out slavery and have an economy that ran more like the rest of the countries. That was Lincoln's thought. So he wasn't necessarily calling for the immediate abolition of slavery. He just wanted to limit it and let it die out on its own. Now, what about Dred Scott and all this? All right. Lincoln's position is very much against what the Supreme Court had said in Dred Scott just a year earlier. And even Douglas's position of popular sovereignty, while that doesn't necessarily go against Dred Scott specifically, we've already seen that, in a state that had voted to outlaw slavery, people could bring slaves in those states without those states gaining their freedom. So it's questionable to the extent any state can really enforce its anti-slavery laws. So it's not clear that either of these people's positions, either of these candidates' positions would survive Dred Scott, but nonetheless, those were their positions. Now, during the campaign, Lincoln gave a very famous speech. It's called the House Divided speech. What Lincoln said is, a house divided against itself cannot stand. All right? And what he's saying is, look, if we continue having half the country pro-slavery and half the country against slavery, and they're constantly fighting each other, then America's going to fall apart. America can't stay a united nation if it continues to be divided on this slavery issue. All right, so he is very prophetic here. He's very much predicting what's about to happen in just a couple of years. And this is a very, very famous speech, again, called the House Divided speech. Now, during that summer or fall, Lincoln and Douglas had a series of debates all across Illinois, and these became very, very famous, even though they were taking place in Illinois. Transcripts or summaries of the debates were actually published in newspapers in other states as well. And again, neither argued to abolish slavery, but Lincoln certainly argued against letting it expand into new territories. He very much wanted to limit slavery to where it already existed. So now, who do you think won this election? That's right, Stephen Douglas won the election. But Lincoln became very famous nationally, again, because of the series of debates with Douglas. And these are still sort of seen as the the example of how politicians should conduct themselves in elections. Two people should have their, have debates with each other to let everybody know how they stand on the issues, and then let the voters decide. And this is one reason, pretty much all elections, certainly from senator and president, those big elections, they always include debates. And this, I'm not saying Lincoln and Douglas were the first politicians to debate each other, certainly not. But these debates became very, very famous, and they definitely set an example for later elections. Now, John Brown, let's return to him, the guy who orchestrated the Pottawatomie Creek massacre. But his violence did not stop at Pottawatomie Creek. No. So in October of 1859, John Brown, along with followers, attack an arsenal. Now, if you don't know, an arsenal is a place where weapons are stored. He attacks an arsenal at Harpers Ferry, Virginia. And Brown planned, his plan was he was going to go and basically get all these weapons that the state of Virginia was storing. He was going to capture the weapons, and then he was going to give them to all the slaves in the area, who would then basically kill all the slave owners and effectively overthrow slavery like that. All right, so Brown was planning an armed revolution against slave owners. But the problem is, he was expecting, say, thousands of slaves to basically, flee the plantation and come to Harpers Ferry and get their guns and go back and fight. And that just didn't happen. None of the slaves in the area ran away to join his rebellion there. So it was limited to maybe just a couple dozen people, which wasn't a good thing for them when Robert E. Lee and the U.S. Marines show up. They attack Brown and his men there at Harpers Valley. They killed 10 during the battle. They end up capturing 7, including John Brown. And since this is basically, somewhat treasonous against the state of Virginia by trying to capture their military arms and use it against the state, he was sentenced to death. But before he was hanged, he wrote that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood. So he's, again, as I mentioned at the very start of this lecture, John Brown very much thought slavery is a sin. John Brown was very, very religious, and he thought slavery was a sin. And so what he's saying is that these crimes, this sin of America, is never going to go away without bloodshed. He had sort of kind of thought if he could just sort of spark a revolution among slaves in that area, that slavery everywhere would go away. But that turned out not to be the case. And of course, Brown had already, spilled blood in Pottawatomie Creek at Harpers Valley, so he was kind of the cause of some of this bloodshed. But this is often seen, this statement he gives right before his death in 1859. This statement is very much seen as a prophecy that the Civil War is about to happen, which it does in 1861, so less than a year and a half after Brown's death. The country is in fact at war, and they end up killing 700,000 people and injuring at least that many, probably more. All right, so make sure you understand and remember who John Brown is and his roles at Pottawatomie Creek and Harpers Ferry. And Harpers Ferry, again, the Civil War hasn't officially started yet. That's not going to start until 1861. But with Bleeding Kansas and now in Harpers Ferry, we're starting to see the ramping up of violence. And these are the first kind of what I'll call a dress rehearsal. Right? It's sort of practice for the Civil War that is to come very shortly now. And just one more thing basically has to happen for the Civil War to begin, and that is the election of Abraham Lincoln. So let's go through that 1860 election. The Republicans nominate Abraham Lincoln as their presidential candidate. But the Democrats do something, at least from a political standpoint, was pretty insane and not a good strategy. They nominate two different people. Your Northern Democrats, who wanted, again, slavery to be decided in the territories through this popular sovereignty, this vote in each of the territories. So they were open to the idea of slavery expanding, but they weren't necessarily requiring it. They kind of took a position that we don't care if slavery expands or not. People in each state or area should decide for themselves. Those were the Northern Democrats' position, and they nominate Stephen Douglas. And after he had just beaten Lincoln in the senatorial election 2 years earlier, so they're going to see if he can beat him for president as well. The Southern Democrats, however, didn't want to leave slavery open to votes. They just wanted slavery to be allowed in all these territories, period. They didn't want to have to go through a series of votes. They just thought slavery should automatically be allowed in any of these western territories. And so they didn't like Douglas's position. They thought it was too middle ground for their approach. And so they nominated this guy named John Breckinridge. And to top it off, you had a third party called the Constitutional Union Party. And they nominate John Bell. And the Constitutional Union Party, they sort of officially didn't really have a stance on slavery officially. Their position was, we just want to uphold the Constitution and keep the Union together. Now, the problem with that is, it's pretty clear that the Constitution allows slavery. After all, you had the Three-Fifths Compromise, you had the Slave Trade Compromise. And to keep the Union together, you're going to have to allow slavery in several areas. So, although the Constitutional Union Party tried to pretend that they didn't really have an opinion on the slavery issue, in effect they did. They were supporting at least the continuation of slavery. Even if they weren't actively seeking to expand it, they certainly were in favor of letting it continue. So there are your players. So you have four people running for president. One Republican, two Democrats, and one Constitutional Union Party. And what happened is most people, especially in the North and then far out West, who opposed slavery, they ended up voting for Lincoln. So if you see on this electoral college map I have on the screen, all the red states, they voted for Lincoln. And just a quick reminder of geography back then, most of the states in the North had much, much bigger populations than the states in the South, and so therefore they got more votes in the Electoral College. So even though it looks like there's almost as much green on this map as red, the red states get much more votes in the Electoral College. And so Lincoln, nationally receives about 40% of the vote. He's not even on the ballot in most states in the South. His name doesn't even appear. He didn't have enough support to even get on the ballot. And he received about 40% of the vote nationally. But because the pro-slavery group, the Southern Democrats, the Northern Democrats, and the Constitutional Union Party, they all kind of split their votes among those three other candidates. And so Lincoln, at least in the North and out West, he kept coming in first. He wasn't getting 50% of the vote, but he kept coming in first because all those other people were getting 20% each, basically. And so this allows Lincoln, who only got 40% of the vote from the people, to get well over 50% of the vote in the Electoral College. So Lincoln becomes America's 16th president. Which immediately causes South Carolina to secede from the Union. All right, so the election takes place in November, and in December, South Carolina secedes from the Union. All right, now remember, and there's a reason that the subtitle of this slide is South Carolina finally tears apart the Union. Because remember, all year long we've been talking about South Carolina. During the Constitutional Convention, when it was proposed that the slave trade be abolished in the Constitution, South Carolina said they won't join the Union if that happens. Then when you had your tariffs of abomination in the 1830s, South Carolina threatened to secede. Now, at that time, they ultimately backed down because they weren't willing to really tear apart the country and form their own country just over a tariff. But over slavery, they were allowed to. They were willing to tear apart the country. Okay, so South Carolina starts in December of 1860, and over the next 6 months, 10 other states secede as well. And 7 of these states, they seceded from the Union before Lincoln even took office. Lincoln gets elected in November, but back then, elected presidents didn't take office until the following March. All right, so before Lincoln had done a single thing as president, 7 states had already quit the Union, and then 4 will quit in the first few months he's in office. And their argument was that since they voluntarily joined the country, the states had a right to leave the country. And they also believed that states had a right to have slavery, and that Lincoln's election threatened their states' rights. Okay. So let's pause here for a minute. A lot of times you will hear people try to argue that, well, the Civil War, it wasn't about slavery, it was about states' rights, which is a very circular argument, because the states' rights that they cared about was the right to own slaves. Okay? They weren't leaving the country over the right to build a canal or to oppose a tariff or anything like that. No, it was the right to have slavery. Okay? So yes, while the South tried to frame it as a states' rights issue, the only right that they truly cared about here was the right to own slaves. Okay, so so if someone ever tries to say that the Civil War wasn't about slavery, it's about states' rights, just point out, that it was the right to slavery was what was at issue. Now, you had 11 states leave the United States, so they had to form their own government. So these 11 states form what is called the Confederate States of America. All right. And just going forward, throughout the Civil War and these lessons, that's what we're going to talk. Those are the names we're going to use. When I talk about the United States or the existing United States or the North, I'm going to refer to them either as the North or the Union, because they're still part of the Union. Those states didn't break up. They remain part of the Union, the United States. Okay. So the northern states, that'll be the Union. The breakaway, the rebel states, will be referred to as the Confederate States of America. Or the Confederacy is another name for them. And so this Confederacy elects Jefferson Davis as its president and Alexander Stephens as its vice president. Now, let me give you some background or information you may need to know. Pretty soon after being elected vice president, Alexander Stephens gives what is called the cornerstone speech. And the cornerstone is sort of an analogy to building a building. And the stone, kind of large stone that you're going to put down first, is going to serve as the sort of the corner of the foundation. So it's kind of what you build upon in a building. So he uses this metaphor. And he said that the cornerstone and foundation of the Confederacy is the idea that African Americans were, in his words, not equal to the white man, and that slavery is an African American's, and again, these are Stephens' words, natural and normal condition. So this is a speech that the Confederate vice president gave soon after the Confederacy was formed. Okay, so this is clearly giving the ideas of what the Confederacy is built upon. So if anyone ever tries to argue that the Civil War was not about slavery, remind them of this speech. This speech is even more remarkable in that he criticizes, Alexander Stephens criticizes, former slaveholders like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, and saying, look, the problem with, he mentions Jefferson by name, he doesn't mention Washington by name, but he kind of refers to that group of people. And he says, their problem is that although they owned slaves, they seem to acknowledge that slavery was bad. To Stephens wasn't even willing to acknowledge that slavery was bad, which Jefferson and Washington, even though they owned slaves, were at least willing to admit that it was probably wrong that they did so. But Stephens says, no, absolutely not. People shouldn't admit that slavery is bad, according to the Confederate vice president. And so if anyone ever tries to tell you the Civil War is not about slavery, or tries to defend the Confederacy, point them to this speech, and point out that although people later tried to claim that the South didn't break away for slavery, In fact, when they broke away, they gave speeches explaining why they were breaking away. They wrote, sort of declarations of independence about why they were breaking away, and they constantly referred to slavery. It was very clear from the people doing it that to them it was about slavery and the preservation of slavery. Okay, so if anyone tries to tell you different, point them to this speech. All right, so next up, the Civil War. We've now gone over the causes of the Civil War. In our next lesson, we'll start talking about the war itself.